Let's talk about tax. US President Donald Trump is talking about abolishing the IRS. Sounds very exciting. Florida Governor Ron Desantis has now come out saying that he wants to get rid of land tax in his state of Florida. All very interesting, but the reality is that here in Australia, we are subject to no less than 125 different taxes. In the US, it's not much better with 97 taxes just in the federal tax code, and then you have to add all of the various state and municipal taxes that you have in the US as well. We are well and truly overtaxed, not just in the tax rates, but in the plethora of taxes that exist. Let's talk about tax, try to understand what can be done, what can't be done, and what we should be hoping for. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help people like you understand the world around you and especially the way the world is changing. And the world is changing in some really great ways. But one of the things that is not likely to change anytime soon, I'm sorry to say, is the issue of taxes. In fact, there's that saying, the two things in life are inevitable, death and taxes. And in fact, you can probably cheat death for longer than you can cheat on your taxes and get away with it. I don't recommend you try that, by the way, because the tax office in Australia and the US and the UK and pretty much every Western country, they all operate basically the same way, which is they say, you owe us taxes. And you say, oh, okay, how much do I owe you? And they say, we're not going to tell you. Oh, so you don't know how much I owe you? Oh, we know how much you owe us, but we're not going to tell you what it is. You have to figure that out for yourself. Oh, what if I get it wrong? Well, then you go to prison, so make sure you get it right. Which sounds all well and good if you're the tax man, but reality is unfortunately that it's almost impossible to calculate how much you owe and get it right. This has been put to the test, by the way. In 1998, Money Magazine had a bunch of US tax professionals calculate the same scenario of income tax for a hypothetical consumer. They came back with different numbers. The tax professionals who, personal income tax is kind of their bread and butter, could not agree on how much tax the same scenario owed. That test was repeated in 2009 when PC World put a bunch of software packages to the test. Again, the same scenario was fed to each of these software packages that were supposed to calculate what you owe on your taxes, and they came back with a bunch of different numbers. So, unfortunately, whilst taxes may be inevitable, it seems that they are somewhat incalculable in the sense that even once you've done the numbers, you can't be 100% sure that you're correct. And it's in this context that tax agencies around the world have become some of the most unpopular. They come along, they take your money, they tend to behave like bullies, and no one really likes them. So lots of people are getting excited now that President Trump is saying, hey, I might abolish the IRS. Take that with a grain of salt, by the way. I think that was some bluster that served his purposes at the time when he was talking big about tariffs and the ERS, External Revenue Service. I don't think that plan's going to materialize. I think it was a bargaining chip. We'll get to more of that in just a minute. But for the moment, we can at least accept that the idea is being mooted. The idea that perhaps the IRS and income tax specifically shouldn't exist. Ron Desantis talking about getting rid of land tax. And of course, the US, being a federalist system, have each state with their own taxes. That doesn't happen so much here in Australia. In the US, the ability to have income tax and land tax and GST or VAT, value added taxes and things like that, is a state responsibility. And so it changes and varies from one state to the next, which allows them to do their own thing and allows us to see what works and what really doesn't. We don't have that same freedom here in Australia. It does make our system simpler because the GST, etc., are all the same across every single state, but it also means that we haven't had quite the same experience as what you Americans have had in terms of experiencing different tax regimes and seeing what works and what doesn't. Now, of course, Trump in his first term introduced the Trump tax cuts. This was a reduction in the marginal tax rate for income tax. Had some effect on businesses, some effect on individuals. I'm not going to go into the details, but ultimately he wasn't getting rid of a tax. He was just reducing the tax rate. And that's an important distinction when we talk about taxes and getting rid of them. Are we talking about reducing the tax rate but keeping all the taxes in existence? All 125 taxes in Australia, all 97 federal taxes in the US? Or are we talking about actually eliminating an entire tax, an entire type of tax? Because those two things are very different things. Let's talk about the rate of tax for a moment. Let's take income tax. It's one of the biggest taxes that we all pay. It stands to reason that if you set the tax rate for income tax at 0%, you're going to get no tax revenue, obviously, because 0% of anything is still zero. But also, if you set the income tax rate at 100%, you're also going to get zero because no one's going to bother to earn any income. No one's going to do any work if 100% of it's going to be taken off them. We see exactly this play out in the former USSR, where, of course, the government took ownership of everyone's production, everyone's work. Productivity collapsed. Everyone just worked the absolute bare minimum that they could get away with. They had the saying, of course, in the USSR that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Productivity collapses, which means quality of life collapses and the whole economy goes down the drain. We've seen that. That's what happens when you tax at 100%, which is effectively what communist countries do. So, 0% tax, zero revenue. 100% tax, also in the end, zero revenue. But somewhere in the middle, the tax revenue peaks. Now, this curve of tax revenue versus the tax rate is called the Laffer curve. It's something that economists do pay a lot of attention to, probably not as much as they should, but they do at least know that it exists. There's argument about exactly where the peak of that curve really is, but the general consensus seems to be that somewhere when it comes to income tax, high 20% to low 30% is where the peak is. And if you start to push marginal tax rates above the low 30%, let's call it 35%, then actually, as you raise that rate higher, what you're going to do is change people's behavior more and more and more. People will do more to avoid paying taxes. They'll start to shift their operations offshore. They'll start to say no to the overtime because they'd rather sit on the bank fishing than work overtime if they're going to get taxed at 50% on that overtime. You start to change people's behavior in ways that mean that even though the tax rate is higher, the tax revenue hasn't actually gone up and in fact will start to go down. So that's the Laffer curve, and we know that there is a peak. There is a point, and we might argue about what that point is, but there is a point at which raising the tax rate will not raise more revenue. And in fact, if you're already too high, lowering the tax rate could have the effect of increasing the amount of revenue the government is taking in because people's behavior will again respond to that change in incentives. So, as we hear politicians talking about taxes and tax reductions and freeing up the economy, what should we be hoping for? Elimination of types of taxes so that they're just gone completely and the 125 taxes in Australia becomes 124 or maybe 50 or heaven forbid maybe only 10, or the 97 taxes in the US maybe drops to being 50 or 25 or 10. Is that what we should be hoping for? Or should we be hoping for reductions in the tax rate, where the income tax rate that you pay might come down, the company tax rate that you pay might come down, the fuel excise that you pay might come down, and all the taxes still exist, but the rate at which you're being taxed goes down? Which one is better? And of course, I'm ruling out the hypothetical scenario that I would personally love, which is to have zero taxes, all at zero tax rate. Let's just take that off the table for a moment because I don't think that's a realistic option, at least not in the next 4 years of the Donald Trump presidency. Every tax is inefficient for two reasons. And when economists use the word inefficient or use phrases like efficiency, what they're talking about is the fact that every dollar in tax that your tax costs you doesn't really result in a dollar of tax revenue to the government. And it doesn't really translate directly. There's inefficiencies in that transfer. Why is that? Well, because when you pay tax, you have to spend time calculating what that tax burden is. You might have to pay a tax accountant to give you advice on that topic. You're losing time, you're losing money. So now that, let's say, $1,000 in tax that you hand over to the government actually cost you more than $1,000. It cost you $1,000 plus the tax accountant plus the time that went into it. But also, it changed your behavior in ways that weren't necessarily good for the economy. So obviously, the taxes are just a percentage of the economy. Economic activity is what gets taxed. All the different types of taxes that exist, they're all ultimately taxes on economic activity. They can be taxes on ownership, such as land tax. That's a slightly different thing. But fundamentally, economic activity is a good thing from a tax revenue point of view. So if you impose a tax that causes people to engage in less commerce, well, there's that Laffer curve thing again, where now you're going to get less tax revenue than you thought because people change their behavior. Again, economists talk in weird terms. They talk about the elasticity of demand. So if you apply lots of tax for something onto a product and make it stupendously expensive, it's not that you're going to automatically get all that tax revenue because lots of people are going to look at the new price and go, well, I'm not buying it now. The demand is elastic. People change their behavior based on the incentives. And so a tax that changes people's behavior in a big way is inefficient compared to a tax that doesn't change people's behavior as much. But then there's also the enforcement overhead and all the government costs. So they take $1,000 in, but some of that money is lost in just running the IRS or the Australian Tax Office itself. It's not as though the government has $1,000 to spend. It loses a bunch of it along the way because of just government inefficiency. And so the efficiency of a tax, the degree to which the amount of money and time and everything that it costs the taxpayer translates as directly as possible to revenue for the government, is a fairly important concept when we're talking about tax. And again, I don't like tax. I don't want any of them to exist, but I'm taking it as a given that they do. And just let's talk about what's the best way to make the pain of tax as minimal as possible. So taxes can be inefficient because they distort people's behavior, and they can be inefficient because of just the administrative overhead on both sides of the transaction, on the government side taking that tax and also on the taxpayer's side spending that tax. For this reason, I believe that eliminating entire types of tax is better than reducing tax rates. Because if we eliminate an entire type of tax, we've eliminated all of the administrative overhead in relation to that tax. And given there are 125 taxes in Australia, there's quite a lot of them that really aren't bringing in very much revenue. So surely we can just get rid of them. Get rid of the administrative overhead, get rid of the hassle and the headache and the compliance costs, simplify the tax office itself. Same thing in America with the IRS. There are 97 different federal taxes. Most of the government's revenue comes from 10 or less of those taxes, which means there's about 87 that could be gotten rid of with relatively small impact on the US federal budget. So why don't we? Let's just get rid of all of that administrative overhead, all of that headache, all of the compliance costs, and all of the IRS agents needed to keep track of those petty, small taxes that don't bring in all that much revenue. That would be a very, very good place to start. And as we remove those taxes, the distortion to people's behavior will start to be lifted. People will start to behave in the way that they would in a genuinely free market without the distortions of government taxes and regulations that then change their incentives and change their behavior. Their behavior becomes more efficient as far as the economic perspective is concerned. But there's actually a really interesting detail here that not a lot of people have thought about. And that is the difference between an inflationary tax and a deflationary tax. Or to put it a different way, what happens when you get rid of one type of tax is different to what happens when you get rid of another type of tax. Let me give you a really simple illustration. If we were to abolish income tax completely, well, happy days, everyone would celebrate because now when they get their paycheck, they get their entire paycheck, all of those dollars. Now, let's say you're on 100 grand a year. Let's just pick a number out of thin air. You're getting $2,000 a week, and all of a sudden you're getting all of those $2,000. None of it's being taken by the tax office. And so now all of a sudden your cost of living pressures have been eased tremendously. You can go out and spend money much more freely than what you could before. This would function as an economic stimulus. This means there are more dollars chasing the same number of goods as what we have in the economy right now. This is going to have an inflationary effect. This is going to have the effect of making the cost of living more expensive because without improving productivity, we've now got people chasing those products with more dollars. It's the same as if the government just handed out a bunch of money, which we know the consequences of that because we saw it happen in Australia during all the COVID lockdowns. What happens? Inflation happens. The same thing would happen here. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't abolish the income tax. I'd love to see the end of the income tax. I'm just saying that in that moment, the effect of that is going to be, it's going to cause an inflationary spike. But now contrast that with something like a payroll tax. And I don't know if there's a US equivalent, but here in Australia, companies that pay payroll, that have employees, if they have more than a certain number, they have to pay tax on the payroll. Now, that adds to their cost of doing business. It adds to the cost of providing the goods and the services that that business provides. If we were to eliminate something like a payroll tax that is actually just driving up the cost of goods sold, then instead of people having more money in their pocket, what they're going to find is that prices start to ease. The shelf price of products and goods and services starts to ease more as companies don't feel the squeeze quite so much and they start to be able to compete with each other and try and attract people's business by dropping their prices. So eliminating that type of tax, the type of tax that adds to the cost of goods, would actually be deflationary, as opposed to eliminating the type of tax that leaves more money in your pocket would actually be inflationary. It's a detail that not a lot of people have thought about, but if we're going to have a conversation about eliminating entire taxes and just abolishing them out of the tax code entirely, which I would highly recommend, we probably should take into account the effect in terms of which ones we're choosing, because unfortunately it's not going to be all of them. We should probably have a think about which ones are going to have the desired effect on the economy. And I would suggest that right now, with cost of living being the way it is and inflation being the way it is, and with the uncompetitiveness globally of most Western economies, we don't want to pick the inflationary option. We want to pick the deflationary one. So that would be things like eliminating value added taxes or GSTs, eliminating things like payroll taxes, eliminating all the things that drive up the cost of doing business. If businesses don't have those costs, then they don't have to recover those costs out of their prices. And that means in time with competition, prices are going to ease, or at the very least, they're going to stop climbing at the same rate that they currently are. That will have the same positive effect on consumers. We'll all find that our dollars go further. We can now live better. The cost of living crisis will ease, but it will ease for the opposite reason. It won't ease because we've got more dollars with which to chase what we want. It'll ease because the prices are easing on the shelves. And personally, I think that's a much better way to do it. So, what should we be hoping for? When it comes to tax reform, what should we be hoping for? And again, I'm taking off the table the thing that I would actually hope for, which is no taxes ever, zero tax rates on zero taxes. That'd be great, but I don't think it's realistic. So, what should we be hoping for? As we hear Donald Trump talk about massive tax reform, yes, I think in his case it was probably a negotiating gambit, but hopefully there is something serious behind it. Time will tell. But we do see Ron Desantis talking about getting rid of land tax. And I'm sure that the Trump effect is going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of state governments and other federal governments around the world to review how much they're charging their citizens in tax and how much their government is costing their citizens. So, what should we be hoping for? I think first and foremost, a dramatic simplification of the tax code. That's going to require the abolishing of heaps of tax types, just completely getting rid of them. The simplifying of the reporting and the compliance around the remaining tax types that aren't being abolished. And I would also hope a reduction in the rates that are being charged on the remaining taxes as well. But there's a really important principle here. We need to make sure that this is being funded through cuts to government spending. Cutting taxes and then making up the difference through increased borrowing doesn't help anyone in the end, because when governments borrow and print money, because they are the same thing in the fiat currency world, inflation makes up the difference. Inflation takes up the slack. And so in the end, consumers are no better off. Taxpayers are no better off. It's just that their tax bill has been split between taxes and inflation instead of all being taxes. So as we clamour for tax cuts and we demand that Trump follow through with some tax cuts, or DeSantis follow through with his, or here in Australia, hopefully we can get a better government at the next election where we might see the chance of some tax cuts. Let's make sure that the shortfall in revenue is not being made up for by just borrowing and putting it on the credit card. Let's make sure that it's being made up for by efficiency, by doing the kinds of things that Doge is doing in the US, by doing the kinds of things that Javier Milei has done in Argentina. We know it can be done because we're watching it happen right now. That's how we need to fund the tax cuts. So what should we be hoping for? The elimination of entire types of tax. Let's get rid of all the administrative overhead. Let's get rid of all the headache. Let's just abolish as many taxes as we possibly can, either because they don't make enough revenue to really justify their existence, or because they're just too inefficient in terms of the compliance costs and the overheads that they create and the way that they distort people's behavior. Then once we're left with the minimum number of taxes, let's get them down to a minimum level and fund that revenue shortfall, because the government, of course, thinks that all of the money in the world belongs to it, and it's just being nice when it lets you keep some. So the government views a tax cut as spending. They view it the same way. Oh, we're going to cut taxes. How are we going to find the money to pay for that spending? Is how they like to view it. Well, they need to cut their actual spending. They need to cut back on all the waste, all the fraud, and all the unnecessary stuff that they do, so that we don't have to put tax cuts on the credit card. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that'll happen. The amount of tax revenue that they think they will lose won't actually be as bad as they think it will be. Why? Well, because in the same way as applying a tax distorts people's behavior in a way that tends to suppress economic activity, when you take that tax away, economic activity tends to bounce back. Now, probably not by enough to make up the entire difference, but at least somewhat. And if we were to accompany these tax cuts and the abolition of some tax types with a dramatic cut in red and green tape, we could genuinely set the economy free, see a massive increase in economic activity, which, again, because tax is calculated generally as a percentage of economic activity, if we can grow the pie, if we can increase the size of the economy, then that same tax rate or even a lower tax rate has the potential to bring in just as much or more tax revenue, because the pie is bigger. And in the process, it removes a bunch of distortions, gets rid of a bunch of inefficiencies, and allows the entire country to actually be far more prosperous, including the government to have the revenue that it needs for the remaining services that it is actually choosing to provide and saying are essential. Now, I'm a libertarian, so it's very uncomfortable for me to sit here advocating for any taxes at all. I don't want any taxes at all. I don't want any government services. I think it should all be user pays. If you need something, pay for it yourself. If you can't afford it, then put your hand out for charity from a private charitable organization, a church or a local fund or a community fund or something like that. I don't believe the government should be doing just about anything. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world, and so this is my attempt to address taxation on the basis of the world that we do live in. One final note before I sign off. Watch Ron DeSantis. He is a future presidential hopeful. We know that. He's thrown his hat in the ring previously. He wants to be president in the future. And honestly, he might be a really good choice. Now, I happen to like JD Vance a lot. 4 years is a long time, so we'll see what things look like when we get to the next presidential election. But for me right now, I'd be saying, hey, let's give it to JD Vance. Let's give him 8 years, and Ron can line up at the back of that queue, and in 12 years' time, he can have a crack at it. Now, he's probably going to have other ideas. He's probably going to run in the primaries again. He's going to throw his hat in the ring probably for every presidential election for the next 3 or 4 election cycles until he either succeeds or decides to stop. And on that basis, it's worth watching him very closely as he makes his decisions around what to do with taxes in Florida, because that's going to give us a pretty clear indication of what a President DeSantis would do federally if he were to actually become the president. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project. I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around you. And hopefully here today, I've helped to improve your understanding of taxes, how they work, how they make things worse, and how maybe we can make things better. If you've benefited from this video, please leave me a like, leave me a comment, maybe give me a follow and share it with friends. And I'll see you in the next one.